One of my favorite pastimes is finding new games that neither I nor any of my friends have ever heard of. Even if said game turns out to be absolutely terrible, it gives me something new and interesting to talk about and show to people. So, one day while researching stuff for a completely unrelated video, I accidentally stumbled upon the Kadokawa Game Mystery series, a small set of murder mystery adventure games sharing the prefix of root. I love mystery games, so I didn't even think twice and just went right into it. And the more I looked into the series and played the games, the more fascinating it became. So today, I want to tell you about one of the strangest mystery series I've ever come across, for better and for worse. Finding a way to start talking about root letter is complicated. So for the sake of my sanity, let's start with the basic premise. The game takes place in modern day, and starts with the protagonist Takayuki finding a mysterious letter amongst his things sent by Aya Fumino, his pen pal from 15 years earlier. In it she explains how she killed someone and will probably never talk to him again. Obviously confused, he decides that the only natural course of action is to go to the town where the letters were sent from and look for her. Except when he does, he finds out that her house burned down 15 years earlier, and she seems to have been dead for at least 25. From then on, Takayuki tries to look further into the matter by tracking down all of her friends she talked about in her letters, with each chapter being dedicated to interrogating one of them. It's a very strong setup with a lot of potential. So how do you actually play the game? Well, obviously by virtue of being an adventure game, there's not too much they can do to spice it up, but attempts were certainly made. You basically just move from area to area, investigating places with a big cursor and talking to the people and sometimes also showing them stuff. And if you ever don't know what to do, all you have to do is press the think button and you'll usually be told exactly what you need to do. There is one more part that is relevant though. Once you've collected enough clues, you can confront one of Aya's friends and try to grill them for information. These sequences function similarly to Ace Attorney, wherein you'll be hit with a statement and have to point out an inconsistency with it by either asking a counter question or showing proof until whoever you're talking to breaks down. You only get 5 lives for the entire interrogation, so fuck up too many times and you lose. After you whittle your victim down enough, you can drive home the point by using max mode, which is basically just letting a bar fill up to crank up the intensity of what it is you want to say, ranging anywhere from being very subdued to just yelling like a maniac. For some reason they decided that this is where you get infinite tries, so there's no penalty for failing and you can just trial and error it. It's clear that the focus lies in the story, and for a mystery that's usually for the best. But the issue is that the game kind of loses quite a bit of steam once the original hook lets off, and it starts to feel longer than it actually is. What doesn't help is that all of Aya's classmates kind of fucking suck. This isn't to say that they're bad people or whatever, most of them just aren't very interesting at all. I mean, in conclusion, Root Letter is an okay game, and you wouldn't be missing out at all if you just skip it. Is what I would be saying if I were to ignore the absolute insanity that this game carries around in every other aspect. Most important of all, Takayuki himself. There's no other way of saying it, this guy is a fucking psychopath. And I'm not saying this out of exaggeration either, he's genuinely deranged. At the start of the game, he mentions that his own high school nickname used to be Max, because he's always giving it his all. I call bullshit. They probably called him Max because he's a pain to the max to deal with. He's rude, abusive, abrasive, and manipulative. He will do anything from making a stress eater relapse to blackmail to identity theft, all to get his way. His idea of being humble is insulting someone to their face repeatedly, and then he has the gall to get upset when people don't like that. See, while he's tracking down Aya's old classmates, he refuses to refer to them by literally anything other than their high school nicknames, and it leads to some absolutely ridiculous situations. For instance, one of them had the nickname of the Chatty Bitch. So what does Mr. Max do? He fakes another person's identity in order to meet with the first person he comes across whom he thinks could possibly be her, calls her a bitch to her face multiple times, takes her getting angry at this as a sign that he's right, and then gets upset and asks himself, did I do something wrong? After she kicks him out and tells her co-workers not to let him in anymore. And this is on chapter 2 out of 10. I was legitimately waiting for him to start giving a homeless man isopropyl alcohol under the guise of apple schnapps in order to get something, because this guy has zero fucking hesitation in gaslighting people in order to rob a fucking cat. There is nothing I couldn't see this guy not do. He single-handedly elevates a pretty basic and mediocre murder mystery into an absolutely hilarious black comedy, constantly keeping me on my toes thinking about what crazy bullshit he was gonna do next in order to get his way. And you wanna know what the craziest part about all this is? Most of the reviews you'll find on this game online consider this a negative. I'm sorry that we play the same game. This story would be nothing without Takayuki's insanity. And then there's the other big deranged part about this game. The endings. My fucking god, the endings. As usual, I won't get into spoilers, but I'll talk about them as much as possible without taking anything away. See, at the start of every chapter, you read through one of Aya's letters and then choose what Max replied. Depending on your choices, you get put on a different ending path for chapters 9 and 10. While the first 8 stay identical and can thankfully be skipped on repeat runs. Each and every single one of them tells a completely different story. They all contradict each other hard, and the quote-unquote true ending feels like an undeserved cop-out in favor of everybody involved. After sharing all of this shit with a friend, he ended up convincing me of a very unique reading of this game, and it left left me with two possible interpretations of what this game is trying to be. I'll get to the second one later, but for now let's focus on the one that he came up with. This might sound absolutely insane, but I've come to believe it too. Root Letter is a parody, not just of the mystery genre, but of the adventure game medium as a whole. It somewhat taps into every trope of the genre, from sci-fi to mysticism to romance, each story route being fully committed to fundamentally twisting the narrative to fit those themes, and then presents it in the most spiteful way imaginable, as if to take the piss out of it. There's some other stuff to talk about, but we'll get to that in a bit because first, there's something else to discuss. 2 years after the release of Root Letter, Kadokawa put out a sort of remaster for the game, subtitled Last Answer. This is fundamentally the exact same game with only minor changes. For one, the inventory is much better, so you no longer have to shuffle through every item individually, but they also added small new epilogues to each ending to make up for some of them being so abrupt. It's not a big deal, but it's a nice enough addition. The big change you've probably already noticed from the footage. They added an option to use live action pictures instead of the illustrations, though those are still available too. The characters are kept really close to the originals, and the backgrounds have been recreated very faithfully too, even if the image quality looks like a Facebook post from 2011 sometimes. But for some reason it just looks really uncanny to me. It's hard to put into words, but something about it just seems off. But while we're on that subject, I'd say the original's visuals are actually quite nice. The art isn't anything spectacular, but it's pleasant to look at, and the scenery is quite nice in both versions really. The music is also quite solid, or at least it would be. There's one song that you'll primarily hear while exploring, and it starts over every single fucking time you reload an area. It genuinely drove me insane after a while. So now we get to the other reading of Root Letter I came to. And for that, we need to look at the director behind it for a second. This game was directed by Hitoshi Hasegawa, and is one of the only 3 games he ever directed. He does, however, have quite the track record, having been a project manager for games like Trapped and Fatal Frame 2. Now, what I'm about to say might be completely wrong and uneducated, but as far as I understand it, a director's job is to have the project's full vision and guide everything towards that, while the project manager is there to make sure that said vision comes to fruition. He clearly has some talent for the latter, because those are good games, but I think he has no fucking idea what he's doing as a director, because what are the other 2 games he directed? Well, one are the Wii and 3DS versions of Yuji Naka's Rodea the Sky Soldier, and the other is The Lost Child, the dogshit sequel to El Shaddai that was so bad that they thankfully made it unpurchasable, so that nobody has to suffer through that shit. So, what do I think his grand vision for this game was? Virtual fucking tourism. See, something that I neglected to mention up until now is that the game takes place entirely in Japan's Shimane Prefecture, particularly focused on the city of Matsue, and by god does this game love to remind you of that fact. Every other conversation you have is about some sort of unique aspect of Shimane, be it local cuisine, or landmarks, or other tourist spots, or fashion, or art. One of the menu items is a local guidebook that gives you detailed, often real-world information on whatever area you're currently in. And as far as I can tell, every single live-action picture not explicitly made up for this game is taken directly from its real-world counterpart. I really wouldn't be surprised if nobody actually cared all that much when creating the narrative and just wanted an excuse to show off cool places in Japan. And if that's what you're here for, then fantastic, you're gonna love this game. But it results in a game that often feels like an advertisement for Matsue's tourism industry rather than an actual mystery story. And I really don't know whether I can wholeheartedly recommend this game, but I do know for a fact that it is one I am never going to forget about anytime soon. 2 years after the release of Last Answer, Kadokawa Games released Root Film. By most metrics, this is one of those sequels that doesn't actually have any narrative connection to the first, the only similarities being that they're both murder mysteries set in Shimane. That's only partly true, but I'll get to that in a bit. For now, let me give a general plot intro first. Unlike the first, this game is split between 2 storylines. The first follows up-and-coming film director Rintaro Yagumo, though most of the characters in the game refer to him by his pen name Max Yagumo, and his assistant and editor Magari. Turns out Yagumo was selected to be one of 3 competing directors in charge of making a film for a reboot of a 3-part mystery anthology series that was already in production several years ago before being mysteriously cancelled. He obviously hopes that this will be his big breakthrough in the industry, but some higher-ups are against the project due to the original having been cancelled because of some sort of incident. Ultimately, Yagumo's story is about him trying to find out why the original series was actually cancelled. The other story follows Riho, an upcoming actress who mysteriously gets wrapped up in multiple murder cases. The game only has 7 chapters, with 5 being dedicated to Yagumo and the other 2 to Riho. The 2 are seemingly completely disconnected from one another, and one of the more prominent mysteries of this game is trying to figure out how they fit together. This is the game that got me interested in the series to begin with, I'll admit. A murder mystery centered around the film industry sounds way up my alley. And then I found out who directed it and came up with its scenario. One Hifumi Kono. To a lot of you, that name might not mean anything, but he's the guy who created Clock Tower and Steel Battalion, the former of which being one of my favorite horror games to date. After that, I was instantly sold. It seemed tailor-made for me. And yeah, objectively speaking, it's definitely better than Root Letter, but in some ways it's also significantly less entertaining. Let's start with the gameplay. I'm not sure how they managed to do it, but they actually simplified it. You no longer move a cursor around the screen looking for any parts of interest. Instead, you can exclusively select the relevant parts of the screen. The confrontations and max mode have also been simplified and mashed together. You no longer have to present evidence or ask the right questions. Instead, throughout the game, Yagumo's synesthesia starts acting up. For the unaware, that's a real-world condition wherein two or more senses overlap, allowing people to hear colors, or in Yagumo's case, see words. This lets him memorize whatever phrases he deems relevant, and during the confrontations you just select the right one out of like 3 options. Ryo also has this, but it's never actually brought up for her. You only get to make 3 mistakes back to back. But after each one the counter resets, and I can't remember a single instance where even in the worst case scenario, you wouldn't have enough leeway to get away with the process of elimination. It's ridiculous. The worst change though is the removal of the think button, because unlike Letter, film is extraordinarily aimless. It's rarely ever clear where you need to go or what you need to do, and because of this, it ends up doing the one thing I resent in adventure games the most. It devolves into little more than exhausting every single option a million times until you can continue. What doesn't help is the pacing. The plot is dreadfully slow, and it takes until the last 3 Yagumo chapters to pick up the pace and get actually interesting, because by god are the first 2 and both of Ryo's chapters a massive slog to get through. Unlike in Letter, I actually enjoyed the cast, and Magari was a character I really wasn't expecting to like, but she was surprisingly fun. The issue is that most of the side characters are wholly uninteresting. Every episode also focuses on a singular mystery of its own, like an Ace Attorney, as opposed to being one continuous story like in the first game. Because of this, they tend to feel pretty disjointed. They just fail to leave an impression. Unfortunately, the ending, there's only one this time, also completely lost. It's very abrupt and feels like the team just had to wrap up development right then and there. So while the game's story did leave me wanting, I really did like the presentation. The art style is pretty distinct as far as visual novels go, and it felt like they were always mixing it up in some way. It's a stark contrast to the soft art of Letter, instead of opting for a much sharper vibe, constantly using the movie theming as a really clever framing device to give the scenes a distinct visual flair. The music is also pretty good, even if several of the tracks are reused from Letter. That's actually everything I have to say about Root Film itself. It's a confused mess of a game that ultimately concludes in being just alright, with my final thoughts after finishing it being, what the fuck was Kono trying to do with this game? And then while looking into the games just a bit more, it dawned on me. None of this is real. And I don't mean it in a obviously it's not real, this is a video game, or a game theory, is everything actually a dream kind of way. No, I mean that the events of the games never actually happened in-universe. See, in an interview, the developers of Letter explained how they wanted the series to share in-universe fictional actresses. And if you look between the games, you can see several characters who resemble each other and share a voice actor, but are completely different people. These games, in their own universe, are movies or stage plays or something of the sort. The reason why everything in Letter is so contradictory, the reason why the story feels like a parody, is that in a way, its reality is what you want it to be. After all, the play can improvise, the story isn't real, so it can be freely altered. That feels like the natural conclusion to reach, right? But then why have a true ending that tells you that this is what really happened? Why not have multiple endings in film as well? If anything, this just adds credence to the reading that Letter is a genre parody. If you want to sound pretentious, you could say something like, Root Letter is an in-universe avant-garde film that was released with multiple endings to give people a unique viewing experience. After all, that's happened before. The most well-known example being the movie Clue, that released in theaters with 3 different endings. But in that case, what is film trying to be? I guess the most obvious answer would be a deconstruction of the film industry in the form of a murder mystery, but that just doesn't really sit right with me, because it doesn't do anything with that. And I don't think I have a proper answer for what it's actually trying to be. Realistically, I'm reading way too deep into this, kind of like that one old text review of Letter from 2016 I found, where the author had an existential crisis over getting the boring ending. I highly doubt that the devs thought that deeply about it when they were making these games, but the fact that you could logically reach a conclusion like this is genuinely fascinating to me. And so because of this, I think that despite their overbearing flaws and being otherwise just pretty alright, I really don't regret having played both of these games. They got me to laugh and to think and trying to make heads or tails out of why they are the way they are. And I don't think I'll have another experience just quite like that anytime soon again. And usually this is where I'd be done, but against all odds, Root Letter, this niche-ass adventure game for the PS Vita that most people don't even know existed, ended up getting a live-action Western film adaptation in 2022. It to date remains the only visual novel to do so, by the way. And what can I say? Root Letter the movie is honestly one of the most boring films I've ever watched in my life. Instead of actually adapting the plot of the game, it's a gritty and serious reimagining of the broad strokes of the plot, with the setting being changed to America. So as you can expect, it doesn't exactly adapt the plot of the game much at all. The protagonist is some poor poor Mexican guy named Carlos, and after getting a mysterious letter from his old pen pal Sarah telling him she killed someone, he goes looking for her. Because we're in America now, everything is about sex and drugs and abusive parents, and it's just not grounds that this cast was fit to cover. The acting is incredibly bad, the script is painfully dull, and whereas Takayuki is constantly fighting for answers, for better and for worse, Carlos just kind of gets everything handed to him. They also constantly swap between Carlos in the present and Sarah in the past, and it's a really awkward and jarring to follow. I really wouldn't recommend this movie to anybody, it's just extremely dull. And thus concludes the Kadokawa Mystery Game series, at least as of right now. Will there be more in the future? Somehow I doubt it, but what's there was bizarre and entertaining as hell nonetheless. And so, I'm glad that I played through them. This video ended up taking a very different direction than I initially planned, so I hope this didn't feel too much like the ramblings of a madman. With all that said, I wish you all a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night. Cheers.